Nuremberg, October 15th, 1946. Hermann Göring, once the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, sits in his prison cell, clutching a cyanide capsule he'd hidden for months. In 2 hours, he's supposed to hang for his crimes. How did a World War I flying ace become the architect of the Nazi police state? Why did Hitler entrust his entire air force to a man who collected model trains and dressed like a medieval king? And what made this charismatic war hero transform into one of history's most brutal mass murderers? I've spent years researching Göring's rise and fall, and what I found reveals the terrifying banality of absolute power. Let's go back to the beginning, because Hermann Göring's story starts like something out of an adventure novel. Born in 1893 to a Bavarian diplomat, Göring grew up in actual castles. His father was the governor of German Southwest Africa, and young Hermann spent his childhood surrounded by luxury, servants, and the firm belief that he was destined for greatness. But here's where it gets interesting. His mother was having a very public affair with his father's best friend, a Jewish businessman named Hermann Eppenstein. And get this, Eppenstein was literally paying for their lifestyle, including those fancy castles. The future architect of the Holocaust was financially dependent on a Jewish man for his entire childhood. You can't make this stuff up. World War I turned Göring into a legitimate hero. He became one of Germany's top fighter pilots, shooting down 22 enemy aircraft and taking over the legendary Baron von Richthofen's squadron after the Red Baron was killed. Picture this: a young, handsome pilot with ice blue eyes, fearless in combat, beloved by his men. He even earned Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite. This wasn't some desk jockey or political opportunist. This was a genuine war hero with the medals to prove it. But then Germany lost the war, and everything changed. Göring was ordered to surrender his squadron's aircraft to the Allies. Instead, he told his men to crash their planes rather than hand them over. "It is unworthy of a German airman to surrender," he declared. This moment, this refusal to accept defeat, would define the rest of his life. Germany had betrayed him, in his mind, and he would never forgive that humiliation. The 1920s broke Hermann Göring in ways that would never fully heal. Working as a commercial pilot and struggling to make ends meet, he developed a morphine addiction after being wounded during Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in 1923. We're talking about a man who went from war hero to drug addict, bouncing between Sweden and Austria, sometimes confined to mental institutions. His wife Karin watched helplessly as this once proud warrior became a bloated, paranoid mess, popping pills and ranting about conspiracies. But then Hitler offered him something irresistible, a chance to matter again. When Göring rejoined the Nazi Party in 1928, he brought something Hitler desperately needed: respectability. Here was a decorated war hero, a man who could make the Nazi Party seem less like a collection of street thugs and more like a legitimate political movement. And Hitler? Hitler offered Göring the one thing he craved more than morphine: purpose. By 1933, Göring held more power than any man in Germany except Hitler himself. He was Reichstag president, Prussian interior minister, and commander of the Prussian police. Within months, he had created the Gestapo and established the first concentration camps. Let me be clear about what this means. While other Nazis were still figuring out how to consolidate power, Göring was already building the infrastructure of terror. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 was Göring's masterpiece of opportunism. When that Dutch communist burned down the Parliament building, Göring used it as justification to arrest thousands of political opponents overnight. "Every bullet fired from the barrel of a police pistol is my bullet," he announced. "If you call that murder, then I am a murderer." This wasn't some bureaucrat rubber-stamping orders. This was a man who took personal ownership of state-sanctioned killing. And here's where Goering's psychology gets really twisted. He genuinely believed he was saving Germany. In his mind, he wasn't creating a police state, he was restoring order. He wasn't persecuting innocent people, he was eliminating enemies of the state. This is the terrifying thing about ideological fanatics. They can commit monstrous acts while sleeping soundly at night. By 1935, Hitler had made Goering commander-in-chief of the new Luftwaffe, Germany's rebuilt air force. This should have been Goering's moment of ultimate triumph. Finally, he was back where he belonged. Leading pilots, commanding aircraft, preparing for the kind of aerial warfare he understood better than almost anyone alive. The Luftwaffe became his obsession, his baby, his path to redemption. But power corrupted Goering in the most literal sense. As his influence grew, so did his appetites. He collected art stolen from Jewish families across Europe, filling his estate with masterpieces worth hundreds of millions. He designed elaborate uniforms for himself, sometimes changing clothes 5 times a day. He built model train sets that covered entire rooms of his mansion. Foreign diplomats described meeting him in powder blue uniforms with ruby-encrusted batons, like some deranged operetta character. His drug addiction spiraled completely out of control. By the late 1930s, Goering was consuming the equivalent of 100 morphine tablets daily. His staff had to schedule his meetings around his pill schedule. Imagine trying to run an air force while higher than a kite on opioids. This was the man Hitler trusted with Germany's aerial defense. The Battle of Britain should have been Goering's crowning achievement. In 1940, he commanded over 2,400 aircraft against Britain's 700 fighters. The math should have been simple. Instead, it became his greatest failure and the beginning of his downfall. Goering promised Hitler he could bomb Britain into submission within weeks. He bragged that no enemy aircraft would ever reach Berlin. If bombers reach the Ruhr, he declared, "My name is not Hermann Goering. You can call me Meyer." Well, guess what the Germans started calling him when Allied bombers began pounding German cities? Meyer. They literally nicknamed him after his own failed boast. The Luftwaffe's failures weren't just tactical, they were strategic disasters that revealed Goering's fundamental incompetence as a military leader. He insisted on switching targets from British airfields to London just when the RAF was on the verge of collapse. He diverted resources from fighter production to build useless bombers. He promoted his cronies instead of competent officers. Every major decision he made was wrong, and millions of people paid the price. But here's the most chilling part. Even as his military leadership crumbled, Goering doubled down on genocide. He was instrumental in planning the final solution, signing orders that sent millions of Jews to their deaths. When asked at Nuremberg about his role in the Holocaust, he showed no remorse whatsoever. "I did not know Hitler was going to win the war at the time I joined him," he said. "Not I didn't know about the mass murder. Not I regret my actions. Just I didn't know we'd lose." By 1943, Hitler had essentially written off Goering as a military leader. The Führer stopped inviting him to strategy meetings, started making aviation decisions without consulting him, and publicly humiliated him in front of other Nazi leaders. For a man whose entire identity was built on being indispensable, this rejection was psychological torture. Goering's response to losing Hitler's favor was pathetic and telling. He retreated even further into drug addiction and fantasy. He spent increasingly less time in Berlin and more time at his estate, playing with his model trains and adding to his stolen art collection while German cities burned under Allied bombing. The man who had sworn to protect German airspace was literally playing with toys while his countrymen died. The final collapse came in April 1945. With Hitler trapped in his Berlin bunker and Soviet forces closing in, Goering saw an opportunity to seize power. He sent Hitler a telegram asking permission to assume leadership of the Reich, as Hitler had designated him heir back in 1939. Hitler's response was explosive. He stripped Goering of all ranks and titles, ordered his arrest, and denounced him as a traitor. Picture this scene. Hermann Goering, once the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, under house arrest by his own SS guards, while everything he'd helped build crumbled around him. The man who had created the Gestapo was now their prisoner. On May 8, 1945, Goering surrendered to American forces, expecting to be treated as a fellow military officer. He was shocked, genuinely shocked, when they treated him as a war criminal instead. Even at the end, he couldn't understand that his actions had consequences beyond Germany's borders.